Dylan Shaw had always been a man of practicality, someone who didn't involve himself in unnecessary arguments or social drama. After nearly 2 decades managing a mid-sized logistics operation, he had grown accustomed to systems, to processes that made sense, to things either working or not. When he finally bought the property he'd been eyeing for years, a wide piece of land just outside the city limits, complete with a modest home, a gravel access road, and a sloped patch that led to a partially forested ridge, he considered it a long-overdue investment in stability. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his, and it was quiet, the kind of quiet he had worked most of his life to afford. No shared fences, no nosy neighbors, and, most importantly, no unnecessary entanglements with neighborhood committees or bureaucratic homeowners' boards. The land was zoned as private. The driveway was registered with the county as part of the parcel, and the nearest neighbor was over 2 acres away. It was supposed to be simple. The access road ran up from a rural feeder lane that had once served a few agricultural properties and now supported a mix of converted homes and semi-commercial storage buildings. Dylan had negotiated with the previous owner to keep a section of that road designated under his lot number and had it clearly reflected in the deed. He even took the extra step of hiring a property attorney to ensure that no group or local association could claim easement rights without his explicit consent. The road and the land it cut through were unquestionably his. It had taken him months to finalize the paperwork and even longer to clean up the lot. Clearing brush, installing perimeter fencing, regrading the slope behind the garage, and pouring new gravel to replace the old washboard surface that had eroded, over years of neglect. By the time he moved in fully, Dylan felt he'd finally reached a point in life where things made sense again. There were no hidden variables, no shifting schedules, no one arbitrarily moving the goalposts. So, when he returned from a short delivery route one late Thursday morning to find a trench freshly dug across his main access road, he stopped his truck so abruptly the tires kicked up gravel and dust in all directions. At first, he thought it was a construction mishap or some public works crew that had gotten the wrong address. But as he got out of the cab and walked toward the gaping cut in the earth, roughly 3 feet wide and a little more than 2 feet deep, it became clear this wasn't an accident. The trench ran straight across his access point, cutting his property off from the feeder road like a surgical incision. There were no cones, no signs, no barriers, just bare earth and rough-cut edges that suggested this had been done quickly, maybe even overnight. Dylan stood at the edge of the trench for a full minute, silently processing what he saw. The disruption wasn't just inconvenient, it was deliberate. There were tire tracks leading to and from the site, and they didn't match any vehicle he owned. He spotted faint boot prints too, maybe 2 or 3 sets, overlapping in the dirt. Someone had been here, and they had come prepared. He took a step back, scanned the tree line across the road, and looked for any identifiers. Contractor signs, survey markers, anything to indicate this was part of a sanctioned project. But there was nothing. Just the wind and the sound of crows in the distance. He retrieved his phone from the truck and opened the county GIS map. His property lines were right where they should be. The trench wasn't on the public side. It was squarely inside his legal boundary. He cross-referenced the deed records he had saved just to be certain. Same conclusion. Dylan wasn't one to panic, but a growing tightness in his chest told him this wasn't just a mistake. It was a problem. He spent the next hour calling every public works office he could find. County roads said they hadn't issued any permits for the area in weeks. Utilities denied involvement. Even private contractors were out of the question. No one had logged a job order within a mile of his address. Finally, someone at the township's zoning office suggested, off the record, that he should speak with the Local Improvement Committee, a group of residents who had lobbied the area's informal development authority to carry out infrastructure updates without going through the county. It wasn't technically a governing body, but it had influence. Dylan didn't like the sound of that. He drove back to his home, parked his truck along the internal loop of his property, and took the long way around on foot to access the other side of the trench. By the time he reached his kitchen, the annoyance had hardened into something colder. Resolve. He opened a file folder, pulled out every document tied to the land, scanned and resaved them, and sent a message to the same attorney who had helped him close the deal, explaining what had happened. His message was brief but pointed. He included the photos. He didn't ask for a callback. He asked for a restraining order on any further physical access to his land and began drafting a formal trespass complaint. Whatever this committee was, and whoever had authorized this trench, they had stepped into territory that wasn't theirs. The next day, Dylan received a letter, unmarked, folded into his mailbox without postage or envelope. It was printed on heavy white stock, the kind used for invitations or formal announcements. The language was deliberately vague. To ensure proper runoff during the current seasonal drainage cycle, the Improvement Committee has undertaken a temporary diversion channel to support community resilience. We appreciate your cooperation. No names, no signatures, just a watermark of a pine tree in the corner, faint and pretentious. Dylan read it twice and then crumpled it into a tight ball. He didn't bother with further phone calls. He didn't shout into the void or post angry rants online. That wasn't his style. Instead, he walked the perimeter again, measured the length and width of the trench, took more photos, and began designing a temporary solution to reconnect his access road. But this time, he wouldn't just rebuild. He'd make sure that anyone who tried to come through again would have to face a very deliberate obstacle, one that required his permission to lower, one that made a statement not with volume, but with structure and design, something unmistakable. In the meantime, the attorney replied. They would begin formal filings immediately and contact the township for all related project approvals. Dylan sent him the note. The attorney responded in less than an hour. That wasn't issued by any recognized entity. They're trying to establish precedent without authority. Dylan had suspected as much. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat on his porch, staring at the cut in the road like it was a wound. Quiet, sharp, still fresh. He knew one thing for sure. If they had dug it thinking he would quietly go around, they were going to learn something very important. He only builds in straight lines and he doesn't go around anything. It didn't take long for Dylan to realize that what had happened wasn't an isolated decision or a rogue mistake. It was part of something larger, something orchestrated behind closed doors without oversight, conducted by people who were used to doing things without asking. 2 days after the trench had been cut through his access road, he received another letter, this time delivered in a legal-sized envelope and marked with the heading, Notice of Community Infrastructure Collaboration. It looked official, but the language was a patchwork of euphemisms and half-truths. According to the document, his parcel had been identified as a designated runoff corridor as part of an emergency stormwater mitigation plan enacted by the Regional Development Cooperative, an unofficial yet increasingly active body of residents who had organized themselves into a decision-making apparatus. Nowhere in the letter was there any mention of ownership rights, easement requests, or even a basic notification timeline. It simply thanked him for his participation and assured him that the community's best interest had guided the decision. Dylan read the letter 3 times. He wasn't angry, he was focused. This was a tactic he had seen before, in business, in negotiations, and regulatory affairs. It was the weaponization of civility, the way certain people used soft language and vague authority to mask direct violations. The letter didn't just mischaracterize what had been done to his land, it framed him as part of the effort without his consent. That wasn't a mistake. That was strategy. And someone had deliberately placed him in the path of a decision that had already been made. He walked out to the road again, this time bringing a laser level, a field journal, and a soil probe. He took readings, not because he planned to contest the trench on environmental grounds, but because he needed data, something quantifiable, defensible, immune to manipulation. The trench cut was shallow on one end and deeper on the other, suggesting that whoever had dug it had relied on surface estimation and topography assumptions rather than professional survey data. He noted that it didn't connect to any formal drainage path. In fact, it curved slightly off course before ending abruptly near the edge of his eastern property line. The angle was sloppy, the execution amateur, but the consequences were very real. Any vehicle larger than a sedan would now be unable to access his property without risk. And considering that Dylan's entire business depended on scheduled deliveries and pickups using mid-sized trucks and freight vans, that wasn't just inconvenient, it was operationally disastrous. That afternoon, a delivery van attempted to drop off a new compressor unit for his backup generator system. The driver called from the road, confused, asking if he was at the right location. Dylan walked out to meet him, explained the situation, and together they tried to find an alternate route. But the rear access gate was unfinished, and the slope behind the main garage was too steep for equipment. Eventually, the driver had to leave without unloading. Dylan offered to reschedule, but the man told him he'd have to go through dispatch and they couldn't guarantee availability for another 2 weeks. 2 days later, the compressor company sent a cancellation notice. Delivery suspended indefinitely due to site inaccessibility. Dylan didn't reply. He simply added the lost invoice to a growing folder labeled Collateral. His attorney, Jacob Clevenger, had already begun compiling the necessary documents to file an injunction against further interference, but Dylan asked him to hold back, just for a moment. He needed leverage, not just legal arguments but factual contradictions. He suspected that the so-called Improvement Committee had bypassed basic permitting channels to avoid accountability. That meant there had to be a paper trail somewhere. So, instead of charging into a fight, Dylan took a quieter route. He visited the zoning office in person under the pretense of checking the floodplain certification on his property file, something any landowner had a right to do. The woman at the desk, polite and overworked, let him scan the documents himself. Nothing in the file suggested his land was ever part of a designated runoff path, nor was there a record of any community meeting regarding infrastructure updates. What he did find, however, was a footnote in a separate parcel report, one tied to an address several lots south of his, mentioning emergency drainage relief following an unusual flood pattern the previous year. The area in question was elevated, with poor soil permeability and a tendency to shed water downhill. Dylan made a note of the file number and quietly took a photo of the page. Back home, he drew out a contour map, overlaying it with the topographic gradient and the projected direction of water flow from the parcel in question. It was clear. The trench through his land wasn't about stormwater mitigation. It was about redirection. Someone up the hill was getting water buildup during storms, and they needed somewhere for it to go. Rather than address the issue at the source, regrade the lot, install retention barriers, or build proper channels, they had simply diverted the problem. And Dylan's property was now the exit valve. The next morning, a large white SUV parked near the trench. 2 people got out. One of them was Karen Brock, a well-known figure in the area, active in local organizing and notorious for running unofficial meetings on her back patio. She carried a clipboard and wore a heavy wool coat despite the mild weather. The man with her looked younger, unfamiliar, dressed in business casual and holding a laptop bag. Dylan didn't approach them. He watched from his porch, unseen, noting how they pointed toward the trench, took a few photos, and then walked back to their vehicle. Before leaving, Karen stuck something in his mailbox. When they drove off, Dylan waited a full 10 minutes before checking it. It was another folded notice, this time unsigned, reiterating appreciation for his cooperative spirit, and stating that further improvement activity would continue as scheduled. There was no schedule. No one had given him anything. It was bluff stacked on bluff. By now, Dylan had enough. He called Jacob and gave him the go-ahead. Jacob filed for a temporary protective order, requesting an immediate halt to any further excavation or construction activity within the bounds of Dylan's lot. The filing included property maps, photographic evidence, and a written statement asserting that all work had been done without prior notification or consent. Within 48 hours, the court issued a provisional cease and desist, legally binding until a formal hearing could be held. A process server delivered copies to the improvement group's listed P.O. box and left duplicates with the township's administrative assistant. Dylan didn't expect it would stop them. But now there was a line. Cross it, and it became a matter of contempt, not confusion. The day after the injunction was issued, Karen returned, this time alone. She stood at the trench, hands on her hips, scanning the site as if evaluating damage to something she owned. Dylan walked up slowly. Not to threaten, not to argue, but to speak plainly. He asked her if she had authorized the work. She smiled tightly and replied that it had been community-directed. He asked if she had a permit. She said that certain activities didn't require one if they were for the public good. He asked if she had spoken to anyone in zoning. She didn't answer. He nodded and said nothing more. Then he pointed to the printed copy of the injunction posted on a wooden stake by the trench and returned to his house. That evening, he worked until well past midnight, sketching designs, running load calculations, and testing cable tension systems. If they wanted to interfere with his land, they'd now have to negotiate access, not just figuratively but literally. The next day, he began construction on a mechanical drawbridge. Not a crude platform, but a stable, counterweighted structure built to safely span the trench. He had the tools, he had the materials, and, most importantly, he had the authority. Because this wasn't about theatrics. It was about making sure that every step onto his property now required deliberate consent. The next move was theirs. Dylan didn't build things for show. Every piece of lumber he cut, every cable he spliced, every bolt he torqued into place was measured, calculated, and purposeful. The drawbridge was no exception. It spanned just over 16 feet, reinforced with steel hinges scavenged from industrial shelving brackets and counterweighted by a pair of repurposed concrete slabs taken from an old patio foundation. The lift mechanism was operated manually, using a gear winch mounted on a steel post he welded into the eastern edge of the trench. It took effort to raise and lower it, but that was the point. He didn't want convenience. He wanted control. By the time it was operational, the bridge functioned with unflinching precision. It could be raised in under 2 minutes, fully retracted, and locked upright. With it down, the road was passable. With it up, it was an unmistakable barrier, impossible to cross without making noise, effort, and intention. He didn't add a motor. He didn't want anyone hacking into it or overriding it remotely. Everything was analog. Everything was tactile. Everything was his. He didn't make announcements. There were no signs, no declarations. He didn't go online or involve social media. He simply installed it, tested it, locked it in the upright position, and waited. The trench hadn't been filled. No one had returned to dig further or challenge the protective order. But he knew that wouldn't last. He didn't have to wait long. The following Wednesday morning, a mid-sized municipal service truck arrived near the end of the road, idling for a few minutes before backing up as if confused. An hour later, 2 men in utility vests parked in a silver pickup and approached on foot. Dylan stayed inside, watching through the upper kitchen window. They stood at the trench for several minutes, pointing at the bridge, discussing something. One of them took out a phone and appeared to make a call. Another hour passed and a white SUV pulled up, the same one Karen had arrived in previously. She stepped out, this time with 2 others, one older man in a tailored jacket and another woman holding a file folder. Dylan didn't recognize them, but from the way they spoke, gesturing toward the bridge and flipping through papers, it was clear they considered themselves in charge. Eventually, Karen broke off from the group and walked toward Dylan's gate, pausing just short of the property line. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She simply called out in a clipped, performative tone, "Mr. Shaw, we need to speak with you about the obstruction." Dylan opened the door, stepped outside, and stood on the porch. He didn't walk down to meet her. "It's not an obstruction," he said. "It's private infrastructure on private land, and you're trespassing." She offered a tight smile, the kind that people wear when they think they're about to win an argument. "This road services multiple parcels. You can't unilaterally restrict access." Dylan tilted his head. "This road services one parcel, mine, and it's registered as such with the county. I have the documents. So do my attorneys. So does the court." She hesitated, shifting her stance as if trying to decide whether to escalate or de-escalate. "We've had some confusion regarding jurisdiction. We believe the improvement initiative was approved under community standards." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "Then, submit your appeal to the judge who issued the injunction. Until then, the bridge stays up." Karen didn't reply. She turned and walked back toward the others, whispering something as she rejoined them. They stayed for another 10 minutes before finally leaving. The next day, Dylan received a visit from the County Code Enforcement Office. A young inspector named Halloran showed up in an official vehicle, clipboard in hand. He was polite but awkward, clearly aware of the tension surrounding the case. "Got a report about unauthorized construction," he said, scanning the edge of the property. Dylan invited him to walk the perimeter and showed him the bridge. "Everything's on my land," he explained calmly. "No part of the mechanism crosses onto public property. There's no connection to utilities, no excavation beyond the existing trench, no permanent anchors in public right-of-way, and I've already submitted notice of intent to build to your office last week. File numbers in the permit queue. Want to see the drawings?" Halloran looked both surprised and relieved. He nodded. Dylan handed him a sealed folder with diagrams, photos, soil load analysis, and an engineer's stamp of approval from an independent firm he had retained the previous year for unrelated renovations. The inspector spent 15 minutes reviewing the material, took photos of the site, and left with a promise to update the report as compliant pending final review. Dylan thanked him and walked him to the gate. As Halloran was leaving, he muttered under his breath, "This is one of the cleaner builds I've seen all year. Looks like they picked the wrong guy to mess with." But the resistance wasn't over. 2 days later, a flatbed delivery truck attempted to use the road again, this time bringing materials clearly marked for a nearby address, not Dylan's. The bridge was up. The driver honked once, then twice, then got out and walked toward the property. Dylan met him halfway. "You're at the wrong address," Dylan said evenly. "This isn't a through road. And the bridge doesn't lower unless it's for me or someone I authorize." The driver, a large man with calloused hands, looked annoyed. "I was told this road was open. Got paperwork saying delivery's pre-cleared." Dylan shook his head. "Not with me, it's not." The man sighed, cursed under his breath, and returned to his truck. He called someone on the radio, waited a few minutes, then drove off. Later that evening, a folded note was left in Dylan's mailbox again, unsigned, reading, "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Think about the bigger picture." He burned it in the fire pit without reading it twice. That weekend, while Dylan was adjusting the bridge mechanism, he noticed tire tracks along the edge of the southern boundary, deep, fresh, from a heavy vehicle. It was a path rarely used, overgrown and blocked with old fencing. Someone had tried to cut around him. Dylan spent the next several hours reinforcing that side, stacking stone, installing posts, mounting trail cameras at low visibility angles. He added a second layer of security to the bridge itself, a padlocked latch system on the winch crank. Anyone trying to operate it would need both the key and the counter code, which he stored separately. At night, he checked the camera feeds. Once, just after midnight, he spotted someone walking along the trench line, pausing at the bridge, then retreating into the dark. The figure was slim, hooded, hands in pockets. Nothing overtly threatening, but the message was clear. They were probing for weakness. The next morning, the power flickered briefly, then went out completely. Dylan checked the mains, found nothing wrong inside, then walked to the rear service panel and found the lock had been cut. Someone had thrown the breakers and jammed the housing with a plastic wedge. It was subtle, non-destructive, temporary, but calculated. Dylan restored power, replaced the lock, and added a second panel shield. He filed a report with the sheriff's office, not because he expected immediate action, but to create a paper trail. Everything from this point on would be documented. Every incident, every visit, every silent intrusion. This wasn't about property anymore. This was about pressure, about escalation without confrontation. They wanted him to back down, to feel worn down, to doubt the ground beneath his feet. But Dylan didn't bend. He adjusted. He fortified. He doubled down. The bridge stayed up unless scheduled. The cameras ran 24 hours. The legal filings expanded. Jacob prepared a motion to seek damages for interference with commercial operations. They subpoenaed communications from the committee responsible for the original trench, and early signs pointed to a coordinated bypass of permitting channels, with Karen listed as an initiator on at least 3 planning drafts. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was waiting. And Dylan knew better than to confuse the two. Dylan had never imagined that maintaining control over his own land would require such meticulous coordination. By now, the drawbridge had become more than a symbolic gesture. It was a functioning barricade, a piece of engineered resistance that disrupted the flow of assumed authority. Its mere existence altered the dynamic. No one could use his road without his consent, and no one could pretend his property was just an obstacle to be bypassed. And yet, in the weeks that followed, the tension didn't deflate. It calcified into something slower, more procedural, a game of forms and filings rather than tools and machines. The legal process moved, but not fast. Dylan's attorney, Jacob, was deliberate and thorough, gathering every detail needed to not only defend the perimeter, but to establish a formal counterclaim for property interference. But this wasn't just about court hearings or legal briefs anymore. It was about enduring the soft tactics meant to push Dylan into compromise. No one said anything directly, but new games emerged. Misdelivered packages began piling up by his gate, some with unfamiliar names. Noise complaints were filed anonymously with the township, even though Dylan lived alone and rarely played anything. Louder than his own footsteps. A letter arrived from the Environmental Review Office requesting verification of erosion control compliance, a request triggered only by external referral. Dylan responded to each nuisance with stoic precision, logging dates, submitting paperwork, backing everything with photos, timestamps, and official documents. He made no accusations. He simply forced them to confront his preparedness, piece by piece. Still, the wear of constant vigilance wasn't without effect. He didn't sleep deeply. Every outdoor sound drew his attention. The cameras, which had initially provided assurance, began to feel like a tether. Eyes watching a quiet war that never broke into open fire but never ceased entirely. The bridge groaned slightly with every use, and though its construction was solid, Dylan began performing daily maintenance checks, inspecting the cables, lubricating the gears, reinforcing the latch plate. Not because he doubted the build, but because he no longer trusted what others might attempt while he was away. Then, unexpectedly, the momentum shifted. Jacob called early on a Wednesday, his voice more animated than usual. "We got a hold of something," he said. "A clerical record that shouldn't exist. There's a document in the planning office that lists your lot as part of a runoff easement agreement, but it's unsigned. Not just by you, by anyone. It was added post facto, likely attached to a draft that was never adopted officially. But it's being used as if it were real." Dylan sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implication. "So it's fabricated?" he asked. "Technically, no," Jacob replied. but functionally, yes. Someone tried to sneak it into the archive system to give the appearance of compliance, and we've already subpoenaed the digital entry log. The file was added 6 weeks ago, well after the trench was dug. That was the fracture Dillon had been waiting for. Not just suspicion, but verifiable intent. A procedural inconsistency, a measurable breach that could be tracked, timed, and pinned to someone's desk. With that in hand, Jacob expanded the complaint to include attempted land fraud, obstruction of access, and retaliatory coordination against a private landowner. The tone of their case transformed overnight from defensive to assertive. This wasn't a man standing in the way of progress anymore. This was a citizen pushing back against weaponized bureaucracy, and the court would be forced to consider whether a neighborhood committee could impersonate regulatory authority without consequence. But the most telling moment didn't come from the court filings. It came in the form of silence. The unofficial notices stopped. No new visits, no anonymous letters, no service calls. Instead, Dillon received a formal request, signed, notarized, and delivered through Jacob's office, asking for a negotiated access window to conduct maintenance on the trench and drainage flow. The phrasing was cautious, deferential. They no longer assumed his cooperation. They were requesting it. Dillon read the letter carefully. Then he folded it once, placed it on the table, and sat back in his chair. They were retreating, not in public, not with admission, but tactically, as if to buy time, regroup, or minimize further exposure. But the shift was unmistakable. His bridge had become more than an obstacle. It was a boundary they had no language for, something they couldn't categorize because it wasn't part of their system. It required a response rooted in something they lacked, restraint, and the acknowledgement that not every inch of land could be forced into a shared vision. And Dillon, for the first time since the trench appeared, allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, not revenge, just a brief pause to recognize that holding the line had worked. At least for now. He had forced them to blink first. The first sign that the opposition wasn't finished came not in the form of a letter or a legal notice, but through the earth itself. It had rained hard for 2 days straight. An early spring storm that swelled ditches and tested retention systems across the region. Dillon, ever precise, had prepared. He'd cleared the culverts near his garage, laid gravel under the south slope, and even checked the trench's channel lines to ensure that runoff wouldn't pool dangerously. But when he stepped out the morning after the storm passed, he saw it immediately. The trench had changed. Not eroded, altered. The depth was increased by at least a foot, and the far edge had been reshaped into a sharper, more uniform slope. Someone had returned during the storm under cover of weather and visibility and recut the channel. It wasn't random erosion. It was excavation. He didn't react visibly. He walked the edge, took photos from multiple angles, compared them to the previous survey logs and time-stamped drone captures he had archived over the last month. The difference was obvious. The new cut extended the trench directly into the base of a runoff gully that hadn't been part of the original flow. This wasn't just redirection anymore, it was expansion. And whoever had done it had used the rain as cover, assuming the change would be blamed on weather or washed out entirely by the time anyone noticed. But Dillon had noticed. And this time, he responded not with filings, but with escalation. He called in a contractor, not one of the big firms that dealt with county bids or regional work, but a retired civil engineer who now did consulting work on structural reinforcement and flood containment. The man's name was Mark Rowan, and his reputation came from decades in state-level water control management. Dillon didn't need him to fix anything. He needed analysis, external and independent. When Rowan arrived, he didn't ask questions about the drama. He simply measured, walked, and observed. After a full day of review, his verdict was concise. That trench is dangerously regraded. The new slope exceeds stability thresholds. It may survive in dry conditions, but if we get another storm, That water's going to shoot downhill and shear out your lower lot. Whoever did this didn't design it for dissipation. They designed it for speed." Dylan nodded once. "Can you document it?" Rowan raised an eyebrow. "Already started. You want me to send the report to you or your attorney?" "Both," Dylan replied. What followed was not a return to court or a call for county inspection, at least not immediately. Dylan didn't want them to know he had the report yet. Instead, he submitted a work permit for protective grading and temporary reinforcement installation across his lower property boundary. The work was approved within 2 business days. He had crews on site the next morning. They laid barriers, not just sandbags but gabions, stone-filled cages built to resist erosion and redirect flow without collapse. It turned his south yard into something between a levee and a construction zone. It wasn't aesthetic, but it was effective. And more importantly, it was visible. Anyone looking from above would see the message clearly. The landowner was fortifying. It didn't take long for a response. That weekend, a neighborhood gathering was organized at the far end of the road, beyond Dylan's parcel but within earshot. Laughter, music, folding chairs. It looked casual, but Dylan noticed Karen among them, standing in the center with that signature posture, arms crossed, back straight, the air of someone playing hostess to a narrative. No one approached his boundary. No one came near the bridge, but it felt performative, like a staged demonstration of community normalcy. He didn't interfere. He didn't even watch long. He went back inside, reviewed Rowan's report one more time, and drafted a formal notice of observed unauthorized land modification to the county enforcement office, attaching the analysis and a highlighted overlay of the new flow vectors. The complaint wasn't about drainage anymore. It was about unlawful engineering. By mid-week, the impact became more direct. Dylan received a letter from his insurance provider stating that a potential increased flood risk had triggered a reevaluation of his policy. The timing was not coincidental. Someone had submitted the regraded trench data without context, using the storm as justification. The letter included photos, grainy, misframed but clearly taken from a drone or elevated camera. Dylan wasn't surprised. He contacted the insurer, provided Rowan's stamped report, and filed a rebuttal citing negligent external modification. It stalled the adjustment, but the intent was clear. If they couldn't cross his bridge, they'd try to raise the water behind it. But Dylan was not alone anymore. Rowan forwarded his findings to a colleague in the Regional Water Authority, a contact from his old regulatory days, who flagged the trench for review under updated stormwater compliance protocols. And Jacob, now fully mobilized, submitted a supplemental claim to the court, not only citing retaliatory trenching but intentional environmental manipulation to provoke property destabilization. The language was surgical, the allegations specific. It was no longer a nuisance case. It was a coordinated interference allegation with supporting technical validation. Then came the fire. Not a structure fire. Not an act of open violence. Just a pile of wood chips and compost behind Dylan's shed, ignited late at night under suspiciously dry conditions. Dylan smelled it before he saw the smoke. Faint, acidic, wrong. He responded with speed, extinguisher, shovel, containment. It didn't spread, but the implication chilled him more than the flames. The pile had been dry, yes, but not spontaneous. And the wind had shifted just enough to carry the embers away from the structure instead of into it. An inch different, a gust stronger, and it wouldn't have been a warning. It would have been destruction. He didn't call the fire department. Not right away. He documented it. Photographed the scorch marks, bagged what remained of a melted bottle cap he found near the pile. Cheap plastic like the kind from a sports drink. He stored the footage from the camera watching the rear corner of the shed and made a copy for Jacob. When he did call the authorities the next morning, he kept it brief, formal, recorded. They took a report, promised to investigate, promised to get back to him. But Dillon had stopped waiting for systems to act quickly. He only trusted records, evidence logged, timestamps made, trails preserved. Within a week, another hearing was scheduled. The opposing side, for the first time, was compelled to appear formally, not through unsigned notes, not through symbolic gatherings, but in front of a judge. Karen arrived in person, flanked by 2 legal representatives. They claimed no knowledge of the trench's regrading, no authorization of nighttime activity, no involvement in the insurance referral. They portrayed themselves as concerned residents, committed to safety and cooperation. Dillon said little. Jacob presented Rowan's report, the camera footage, the alteration overlays, and the fire incident summary. The judge listened carefully, then issued an extended injunction, expanding the no-contact zone to include any mechanical or environmental intrusion, and set a date for a full evidentiary hearing on potential damages and malicious interference. As they left the courthouse, Dillon didn't look at Karen, but he felt her eyes on him. For a moment, he caught her reflection in the lobby's glass pane, face tight, jaw clenched, not defiant, not composed. Just cornered. That night, as Dillon locked the bridge in the raised position and walked the perimeter one more time under a moonless sky, he didn't feel victorious. He felt necessary. This wasn't about conflict anymore. It was about precedent. About reminding people that property wasn't abstract. It was drawn, measured, and real. And if they wanted to test the line, they would have to deal with every inch of resistance it could deliver. The morning of the evidentiary hearing arrived cold and dry, the kind of morning that stripped everything down to clarity. No fog, no wind, no distractions. Dillon wore a dark jacket and carried nothing but a folder containing his signed statements and a printed copy of the latest inspection results. He didn't bring a laptop or a phone charger or backup materials. Jacob had everything. And more importantly, they didn't need to prepare anymore. The preparation had already happened. Every form filed, every image archived, every line of communication preserved in duplicate. The bridge had stood for 2 months without a single structural issue. The trench had not only been exposed as unapproved, but verified as dangerously altered. And the attempt to create pressure, whether through zoning manipulation, insurance interference, or that fire, had crossed a line too deep to ignore. The hearing room was smaller than Dillon expected, more administrative than judicial. Beige walls, dim overhead lighting, acoustic panels like those in an old-school cafeteria. But the weight in the room was unmistakable. Karen sat across from them, her shoulders tight, wearing a navy blazer that didn't quite fit, her eyes darting between her attorneys as if waiting for permission to blink. She hadn't expected it to go this far. She had expected him to concede, to negotiate, to fold under the strain like so many others had. Dillon didn't even look at her. His focus was on the clerk, the judge, the rhythm of process and fact. Jacob opened with a calm, structured presentation. No dramatic inflection, no rhetorical flourishes. He let the evidence speak. He laid out a chronological timeline. The initial unauthorized trenching, the letter misrepresenting participation, the protective order, the re-excavation under storm conditions, the fabricated easement file entry, the retaliatory filings, the regraded slope engineered for speed, the fire. Then came the documentation. Maps, engineer reports, time-stamped drone footage, audio clips of Dillon's recorded exchanges, county correspondence logs, and the forensic analysis of the melt patterns found in the fire debris. Each point was backed by physical proof. No speculation, no emotion. Karen's attorneys attempted to counter by framing the actions as collective oversight, the result of miscommunication between residents and subcontractors, suggesting that no individual bore responsibility. They portrayed Dillon as overly defensive, resistant to compromise, hostile to shared progress. But the judge interrupted them twice, asking for specific references to permits, authorizations, or emails that established community approval. They had none. When pressed, they fell back on the language of intent, as if good intentions could rewrite trespass law or erase fabricated documentation from municipal servers. Then the judge asked Dylan to speak. He stood, steady, his voice even but firm. He didn't recount his hardships or his stress. He simply said, "I followed the law. I filed every form. I answered every letter. I never trespassed. I never threatened anyone. I just asked that my land be respected. And when it wasn't, I built a bridge to make that boundary clear. Not to block people, but to protect what I've earned." Then he sat down. No more words were needed. The judge's ruling wasn't immediate. She took a recess, returned half an hour later with printed documents, and read directly from her notes. The trenching was deemed unauthorized. The easement file was ruled inadmissible and flagged for investigation. The retaliatory actions, including the insurance complaint and the fire incident, were declared relevant and admissible as circumstantial evidence of a pattern of harassment. Dylan's drawbridge was declared lawful, safe, and within full compliance of landowner rights. The committee, and Karen by name, were placed under formal restriction from any further infrastructural initiatives involving adjacent properties without pre-approval and third-party inspection. But it didn't stop there. The court referred the matter to the district's Fraud Investigation Unit. The false easement entry and misused zoning contacts were forwarded for administrative review, with the potential for civil penalties and criminal liability pending further inquiry. It was no longer just about property. It was about abuse of process. As they exited the room, Dylan felt no sense of conquest. Just a clean line of breath in his chest, something he hadn't felt in weeks. The pressure had cracked, not because he yelled louder, but because he never stopped showing up with the truth in his hands. Outside, Jacob clapped a hand on his shoulder. "They didn't think anyone would bother to fight," he said quietly. "You made it impossible for them not to answer." That afternoon, as Dylan walked his property perimeter for the first time in what felt like months without looking over his shoulder, the sun was out, and the earth was dry. The bridge stood lowered, for now, solid and quiet. No cars approached, no voices called, just the rustle of branches and the sound of gravel under his boots. The fight had drawn to a close, not with force, but with finality. And though the land hadn't changed, it somehow felt different now, more his than ever before, because now it had been defended. In the weeks that followed the ruling, the dust began to settle. Not with applause or ceremony, but with a quiet recalibration of how things operated around Dylan's end of the road. There were no more letters, no unexpected visitors, no gatherings staged at the perimeter. The noise subsided because the message had been received, direct, unequivocal, and reinforced by legal weight. Karen's presence in the neighborhood became noticeably more subdued. She resigned from her post on the community planning group within days of the court decision, citing personal reasons, and though she still lived nearby, she no longer walked the path past Dylan's gate or hosted informal meetings at her home. Whatever clout she had once wielded seemed to dissolve the moment her name appeared in the court transcripts, attached to a failed defense and a pending investigation. For Dylan, the aftermath wasn't about celebration. It was about repair. The bridge remained in place, but he reinforced it with an automated lock system and solar-powered lights, not for intimidation, but for functionality. Deliveries resumed, scheduled properly and cleared through one entrance only. The gabion barriers stayed as well, standing like sentinels along the lower property line, a visible reminder that the ground itself had been made to defend against interference. The fire-scorched patch behind the shed was cleared, leveled, and replaced with a gravel pad, upon which he placed a heavy metal storage unit, sealed, secure, and outfitted with a motion sensor. He didn't talk about it. He simply took action where the silence once lived. Neighbors he barely knew began waving again, cautiously at first, then with growing ease. Some dropped by under casual pretenses, an inquiry about gravel sourcing, a question about bridge hardware, a compliment on the restored fencing line. Dylan answered briefly, always polite, always direct. He wasn't building friendships, but he wasn't closing his doors either. He was showing, through presence and resolve, that boundary didn't mean isolation, it meant accountability. That message resonated louder than any confrontation could have. Jacob finalized a damages settlement with the township's insurer, an amount not large enough to be headline-worthy but substantial enough to restore everything Dylan had spent in labor, materials, expert consultation, and time. Part of the agreement included an internal review of the development cooperative's communication structure, with recommendations for formal transparency protocols to prevent future overreach. Dylan didn't attend the meetings. He didn't volunteer input, but his impact lingered in every clause and addendum. One afternoon in early summer, as he walked the bridge for its weekly maintenance check, he paused at the center and looked out across the trench, now dry, unchanged, undisturbed. The drawbridge had not been lifted in nearly a month. There had been no need, but it remained there,